So what we have seen, what we have discussed so far is mostly early universe where, I mean, density fluctuations are small, typically at redshift of 1,000. Fluctuation in the cold dark matter density is of order 10 to the minus 3. And today, we observe nonlinear structure. So we know that if I linearly extrapolate this cold dark matter density fluctuation, then today it should be of order unity. So linear theory breaks down, and we know that because we observe very nonlinear structures at even large scales, galaxies, cluster of galaxies, and not to speak about stars and planets and all this. Okay, that's another story. So in principle, what you do is you, I mean, now there is an industry of let's say, people running simulations. And so we could also spend quite some time discussing, you know, how do we set up simulations to simulate the nonlinear structures we see today. But obviously, in the spirit of this course, which is supposed to be a Blackboard lecture, we won't start writing C or Python codes on the Blackboard, but I will actually discuss a couple of approximations which give us some insight into, you know, into the abundance and clustering of these of the structures we see today. So obviously what we will do is that we'll avoid discussing baryons because baryons are complicated, right? And the physics of baryon is dissipative, there is radiative transfer, there are all kind of effects which we don't want to go into at the moment. So we will focus basically on cold dark matter, which is simpler, and on top of this, we also know that cold dark matter is approximately 80% of the total budget of non-relativistic matter. So if we can understand how basically cold dark matter clumps and forms nonlinear structure, then we have made a good step towards understanding why we see this range of galaxies and cluster of galaxies on large scales. And so, to understand the formation of nonlinear structure in basically the non-relativistic matter component, so there is a very useful approximation, which is the spherical collapse model, which I will discuss now. So basically, the idea is the following. So you basically consider a top hat perturbation. Okay, with a certain initial fractional over density delta I. So this is basically non-relativistic dust, okay? At a certain initial time Ti, basically on top of a uniform background, okay? And I will assume for simplicity that the background is Einstein de Sitter, okay? So it's a dust-dominated Einstein de Sitter universe with critical density. So the average density of the background is the critical density, and so it goes like 1/6 pi gt squared. And so on top of this, I put a spherical top hat perturbation, which has at some initial time, which I will define later, or basically it's in the past, far in the past, it has some overdensity delta I, and so it has a mass given by its radius, physical radius to the cube, times the density of the background at the initial time, times obviously 1 plus the overdensity. And so Ri is its physical radius at time Ti. Okay? And now basically you do the following. You use the fact that you know from Birkhoff's theorem that such a perturbation such a perturbation will basically evolve independently of the background. Okay? The background is homogeneous and isotropic. Okay? So basically, you have the following picture. What you have is that you have the homogeneous isotropic backgrounds, which expand as an Einstein de Sitter universe. And on top of this, you have this spherical top-hat perturbation, which will actually behave effectively as a closed universe, because it's slightly overdense relative to the background. So if I were to draw the basically physical scales as a function of time at t equals 0, okay, where I would like to set my initial condition, basically, the dynamic of if you want, the behavior of the physical size of this perturbation is basically tangent to the behavior of the scale factor of the homogeneous background. Okay, so if that's the homogeneous background, we'll do something like that, right? So this is A of t, and A of t I know goes like t to the 2/3. Now if I were to plot on this, here, if I now plot the behavior of the radius RT of this perturbation, then at early time it's tangent, okay, and then it decouples and collapses as a closed universe. And then, so I can basically study the evolution of this perturbation, and so I use Birkhoff theorem, closed universe, and I use mass conservation. The mass in this perturbation is conserved, okay, throughout its evolution. Okay? So now what is good is that since effectively this top-hat perturbation behaves as a closed universe, we have a parametric solution for this, which you actually worked out during the exercises, right? It's the cycloid. Okay, so we can recycle this solution and try to adapt it to our problem. So for closed universe, I mean, that's dominated. We had something which goes like, in terms of conformal time, we had something that is going like this. So we recycle this, okay, for spherical top-hat perturbation, and we're going to define we'll write down the time dependence of the physical radius of this perturbation. Let's say in unit of our initial radius as some constant, time now 1 minus cosine of some parameter, okay? And then we do the same for the time. So it's a function of theta, actually, of this parameter. And so we also parameterize the time now with this theta, and so in unit of the initial time, okay, that's what we choose. So the question basically that now we have to do is that we have to understand what are A and B and how do we connect them to actually the properties of this slightly overdense perturbation. Okay. let me say that actually you could do the same analysis if you want for under-dense regions. So I'm assuming obviously that this delta I, of course, it's positive. You could actually consider a negative initial fluctuation, in which case you would basically evolve an under-dense region. So basically what it would do, it would start here tangent, but it would go, its physical radius would go, okay, to infinity actually. And so you can actually proceed through the exact same steps. The only thing that you have to change here is basically you have to trade the cos for a cos hyperbolic and the sin for a sin hyperbolic, and just change the signs of these two expressions. So how do you get... So how do we relate A to B? So to answer this question, basically we use the fact that if I take the parameter theta to be very small, I should recover the background solution. Because this is the limit theta equals 0. And obviously this is theta, you see, theta equals 2 pi here, and basically theta equals 0 here. So you consider the limit. Theta is much smaller than unity. And in this limit, basically, what you have is that the shell behaves as, so the perturbation behaves as the background universe, okay, in this limit. So if you think now of the Newtonian description of the Friedmann equations, you can write down energy conservation. You can start from energy conservation. So energy of, let's say, a test particle of unit mass, which you would put here at the boundary of this top-hat perturbation. Okay? You've probably seen that. That's a Newtonian way of deriving the first Friedmann and actually the Friedmann equations. And so you just use simple energy conservation. So if I put a test particle here, I write down its energy as kinetic energy plus potential energy. So the kinetic energy of this test particle of unit mass would be 1/2 of dr dt squared, okay? It's physical velocity squared. And then the potential energy is simply given by, what is within the sphere, right? Because everything is uniform and isotropic around it. So I use Birkhoff theorem, okay? So the potential of this particle is gm times the mass of the particle, which is said to be 1, okay, divided by r. And I know that in the case of a flat background, this is equivalent to requiring energy which is exactly 0. Okay? If the energy is positive, you get basically an open universe. And if the energy is negative, you get a closed universe. Okay, as we will see. Okay, so that's the limit. Okay? And so this is, of course, valid in the limit if you want Ti goes to 0 or theta goes to 0. Now in this limit, basically what you have is that the velocities, the physical velocities, they are basically the Hubble flow velocities. So you use basically Hubble law in this limit. There is no peculiar velocity. And so you have dr dt in this limit is h times r. Okay, so you get, and then you use that h for Einstein de Sitter, you use that h is 2 divided by 3 times the time, okay, because the scale factor goes like t to the 2/3. Okay. So you find that the kinetic energy of that particle is simply this, and so this gives you 2/9 of R, what do I have? R divided by T squared, and this should be equal because the energy is exactly 0 in this limit, basically. This should give you Gm over R. Okay? That's one thing. Then the second thing that you do now is that you take the parametric solution, which is here, and you expand it at first order in the development angle theta. So if you do that, you find that R for small theta goes like Ri times A times theta squared divided by 2, and then you have T goes like Ti times B times theta cubed divided by 6, okay? On that. And so, if you substitute this expression R and T here as a function of the development angle, you find that because there is actually a R cube, okay, here, and there is a T squared there, the angles disappear, and you end up with RIA cube equals GM BTI squared. Okay, so that's sets basically a condition on what A and B are. They are not independent, all right? I mean, they are related to this relation. And you can actually interpret this relation in two ways. So you see, so either you can look at it from the background point of view, because you are really in this limit here, okay, where the two dynamics that are tangent. From the background point of view, what actually you wrote down here is the simple behavior. It's just the behavior of the scale factor of the background, right? I have R cubed goes like T squared, so R goes like T to the 2/3. Okay? This is just saying that R goes like T to the 2/3. Or if you want to look at this from the point of view of the closed universe, what you actually have here is, maybe you recognize it, it's actually Kepler's law. Third law, I think. Third law. Well, so it goes like the period square divided by the semi-major axis cube goes like this, right? Okay? So this is exactly what you have here, okay, for a bond orbit, but which is radial. Obviously, the orbit is radial, okay, in this case. So from the point of view of the closed universe, what you have is Kepler's law for a radial bond orbit, okay? And the two, obviously, these two have to agree, right? So that's the condition. They have to agree here, okay? And that's what sets the relation between A and B, okay? Oops. Okay, so let's move forward. So now we have to take into account the fact that actually now the perturbation is in fact overdense. So let me see, what do I want to keep here? Maybe I try to... Let me start here again. So now we want to express basically A in terms of the initial condition. Now we have set a relation between A and B from the fact that the dynamic of this background and the perturbation is tangent, okay, in the limit T goes to 0. Now we want to figure out what is A as a function of our initial condition. Basically, how does A depend on the overdensity, the initial overdensity that I pick up at Ti, okay? So basically the idea now is to consider the point of maximum expansion, okay? Which occurs here for theta equals pi. And so if I set theta equals pi, I mean here, in the first equations, the parametric equations for R, I find that R max divided by Ri, so R is equal to R max, and then this tells me that R max divided by Ri is 2a, right? Yes. So now I look again at my test particle, but I have to take into account that it is in fact basically attached to a closed universe, right? So the energy will be slightly negative because it's bound. Okay. So let's use this energy argument again. So as follows. So let's write down the following. The initial kinetic energy of that test particle is actually 1/2 HI because it follows the Hubble flow in this limit. The potential energy is minus Gm divided by Ri. Okay. So that gives me Ki plus Wi as initial energy, and I know that there is energy conservation, so this will be equal to the energy at the maximum point of expansion. And so the energy at the maximum point of expansion is basically simple potential energy at R max. Okay? So let me move back to this. Let me keep these two at the moment. So what I have is E equals Ki plus Wi equals minus Gm divided by R max. And now I need to simplify a bit. Where do I have this here? Yeah, I need to simplify to write down more explicitly what are Ki and Wi as a function of the initial overdensity delta I. So the initial potential energy is minus Gm divided by Ri. And then I will use here the fact that the mass is given by 4 pi 3 Ri cube rho c Ti 1 plus delta I. Okay? That's what I picked up as a mass. And now I substitute this here. And I do a bit of massage. So let me just go a bit further. So you get minus 4 pi G3 times what do I have? R squared. Yeah, so there is a R squared because there is a 1 over R. And then I have the critical density, which I can write as 3hi squared divided by 8 pi G. And then I get 1 plus delta I left. Okay? And so this gives me minus 1/2 of Hi Ri squared times 1 plus delta I, and this is nothing but minus the initial kinetic energy of that particle times 1 plus delta I. Okay? So the bottom line is that this plus this is equal to minus Ki times delta I, and it's less than 0 for delta I positive. As expected, it's bound. Okay, so the energy should be less than 0. Okay? So the trick was actually, you see, the trick was to set the relation between A and B using really like the unperturbed background limit, okay, where you ignore the fact that the perturbation is bound actually, because everything is tangent in the limit t equals to 0. But now, to track the evolution of this slightly overdense region, you really need to take into account the fact that I mean, that it's bound, so its energy is actually slightly negative, and delta I is actually slightly positive. Okay, and so if you do that, so now, and you equate this to this, and you find that actually R max divided by Ri and so now I have R max is, so if I write E equals minus Gm R max, and then equals minus, so I have Ri. If I sum the two, I will have Ri divided by R max times Ki times 1 plus delta I. Then I get R max divided by Ri is 1 plus 1 over delta I, and this is equal to 2a. Okay, so that sets the value of a as a function of delta I. Okay, so I find that a. So a is the following. So it's now let me do the following. Let me introduce a density parameter omega I, which you define as 1 plus delta I. And then from this, you write A as omega I divided by 2 times omega I minus 1. The reason why I introduced this density parameter is simply to show that actually what we are following is a universe with a slightly overdense city, a slightly larger density, and basically the actual density parameter of this universe is just 1 plus delta I. Okay? Because that would really give you, once you plug this there, that would really give you the solution, the parametric solution for a closed universe with density delta I equals 1 plus, with density omega I equals 1 plus delta I, sorry. Okay? And you can use, and so for B, what you do for B, you use you use the relation that we derived before between A and B, this Kepler law. Now, and you insert A into this Kepler law to obtain B. Okay, and so you find the following. So B is omega I divided by, so let me write it here, up there. Let's get rid of that. You find that B is equal to omega I times, so there is this Hi Ti times omega I minus 1 to the 3/2. Okay, is that correct? What was it, GM? Yeah. Yes, and then you have to use the fact that basically Hi goes like 2 divided by 3 Ti. Okay, so you substitute this in there, you cancel the factor of Ti, and you get a factor of 3 omega I divided by 4 omega I minus 1 to the 3/2. Okay? I hope you're following. And the trick then that we will do next is the following. What actually we will do next is that we will consider very small delta I. We will take the limit Ti goes to 0, so that delta I also goes to 0. And so basically omega I will be simply 1 in this limit, actually, this part. I just wrote this down just to show you that, Because if you really work out, I mean, the parametric solution of a closed universe, that's what you're going to find. You're going to find this with A and B given by that. Now what you do is that for the next, for the rest of the calculation, what we will do is that we'll take the limit Ti goes to 0, so that delta I goes to 0. So this actually will go to 1, but the difference between obviously this and 1 is not going to 0, it's going to delta I. Okay, but in this limit, so I will have 1 over 2 delta I, and here I will have 3 divided 4 delta I to the 3/2. Okay? Because to some extent I picked up an initial time Ti, okay, which is somewhat arbitrarily, but I mean, what is really initial is what is here, okay? This is where you should lay down the initial condition, okay? Not here or anywhere else, okay? So until now I did the calculation with some arbitrary small, I mean not with some small but non-zero Ti. Now I want to take the limit Ti goes to 0, okay, to get rid of this I mean, to some extent, arbitrarily choice. Okay. So now we go to the next step. So now I want to calculate. I want to look at the evolution of this top-hat perturbation, so long as it is approximately linear. So it's going to be it's going to behave approximately as linear theory until turnaround. After turnaround, it will really become nonlinear, okay, and actually reaches an infinite density when the angle parameter equals 2 pi, okay. So the actual density inside this perturbation in unit of the background density is basically given by its mass, which is conserved, divided by its physical volume at time t, divided by the background density or the critical density in our Einstein de Sitter case. So this is, so in principle, I mean this m, you remember this m has a factor of 1 plus delta I. But now I'm taking this limit delta I and Ti goes to 0. So when I have a 1 plus delta I ignore the delta I, which is very small relative to 1, and I just approximate by unity. Okay? So there is a factor of 1 plus delta I here from the mass that actually I set to 1. Okay? So in this case, what I have is, so this is proportional to the critical density at time Ti, so I will have this ratio, okay? And then I have a ratio of physical scales to the cube, right? I mean, there is an initial physical scale, initial Ri cube here, and I have to divide from this volume by the actual R at time T to the cube. Okay, and then the factor of 4 pi divided by 3 and the G, they go away, right? Because you find them here and find them there. Huh? Okay. So now I have this, and I know that this is going like 1 over t squared. So this is actually going as t divided by ti squared times Ri divided by R cube. Okay? So I have the expression there. I just substitute the parametric form that I have here. So I get b squared divided by a squared, b squared divided by a cube times theta minus sin theta squared divided by 1 minus cos theta cube. Okay? Nothing but substituting what I have there. And now I use the fact that, okay, I have expression for A and B. Here they are. And I consider very small delta I, so I drop, and I simplify them such that that's what they are, okay? So now if I substitute this and that into this piece, you will see that the delta I go away. Okay, what you're left with actually is a factor of 9 half times theta minus sin theta squared divided by 1 minus cos theta cube. Is that correct? Yes. So now let's check. Let's check that we recover linear theory, okay, at early time. Well, so we do an expansion, right? We do an expansion, and so what you have to do, you have to go actually up to order theta 5, okay? Because first of all, at leading order, you see that, what do you get? I mean, you get nothing, right? Okay? So you go to second order here and third order here. That will actually give you unity. If you just put what you have here. So that will give you the one which is on this side. So you have to go to fifth order here and fourth order there. Okay? To figure out what is the linear theory approximation here. Okay? And so if you do that, you get 3 divided by 20 times theta squared. Okay? Plus higher order terms. Okay? So delta for small theta behaves as 3 divided by 20. Now, what I can use is I can use the following. I can, for instance, expand here this in small theta, okay? Because what I want to see the time dependence, okay, of this delta. And that's how I will see if I get the 2/3 or not. So I go to this equation and I expand it at first order, okay? So I will have t goes like theta cube, right, up to some coefficient, okay? So theta will go like the third root of t, okay, up to some coefficient. Okay? You're following? And so what is this? It's actually, if you just do this here, you get 60 divided by b, ti to the 2/3. Okay? Because there is a square. It's 1/3, 2/3. Okay? So we are happy. We are happy because look, now b, I know what it is. Do you remember? You don't remember. Me neither, actually, but it was, okay, let me check. Oh, I don't remember. 3 times 1, so because I took this omega I is approximately 1. So it's 3 divided by 4 delta I. B is 3 divided by 4 delta I to the 3/2, right? I wrote this down just before. So this, you see, will bring a factor of delta I. There will be a factor of delta I, and then I get the usual growing mode solution. However, I mean, I left some blank space here because it's not 1. You don't get 1. You get 3/5. You get 3/5. So is there a problem with all this? With all what I said until now? No, there is no problem. It's because of my choice of initial conditions. Because remember my initial conditions in terms of the velocities, I assume Hubble flow. There is no peculiar initial velocity, which means that, so I assume that I have a slightly overdense region, so the delta I is non-zero, but the peculiar velocity that should go with this delta I, if I had the growing mode, I should have like a slight infall. Actually, I set it to 0. Because when I did all this calculation with the, you remember the initial kinetic energy Ki, I assumed Hubble flow. So my initial conditions are not the initial conditions of a pure growing mode. They are not the initial conditions of a pure growing mode. And so that's the reason why I get this factor of 3/5. Let's go a bit more into the details here to understand that better. So let's try to understand this better. And the simplest way to understand this is just to go to the continuity equation. Because this way I will see what's the relation between density perturbation, velocity perturbation, okay, and then what I should expect here. So the continuity equation is the following. D delta dt, where it is the usual cosmic time, plus divergence of the physical peculiar velocity, that's physical scale, okay, the standard way, is 0, okay? Now I want to write this slightly differently. I will write this as d delta dA, dA dt, okay, where is the scale factor. So I have A dot d delta dA, and then I move all this on the right side. And now I introduce co-moving scales because we are used to co-moving scale. Right? When we do this linear analysis, as I did yesterday in the previous lecture, I was always using co-moving scales. So R is A times X co-moving. So this becomes minus 1 over A, divergence relative to co-moving position of V. Okay? And now actually, what you do is that you move around the A dot and the A. And what you have in the right-hand side, what you have here in the right-hand side is actually the velocity divergence that I've not really discussed, but that you would be using if you do standard linear perturbation analysis. Okay, and so this is actually what it is. Okay? I'm just telling you, I mean, you have to. So I have the following. So now let's look. Let's assume that actually delta is a growing mode. So delta is a growing mode, delta plus, and it scales like, do you remember the scale factor? What does this imply? That implies that from the continuity equation, okay, so A d delta dA equals theta, this implies that theta plus is exactly delta plus. Huh? I take the derivative, but I multiply back by A, which I have here, okay? So basically, I mean, I can characterize a growing mode in terms of density and velocity divergence, okay? Velocity divergence because we have scalar perturbation, okay? So it's enough to characterize them. I can characterize a growing mode, okay, in the form of a two-dimensional vector delta plus theta plus, which is actually basically delta plus times 1, 1 here, okay? Now I look at the decaying mode. Assume that now you have a decaying mode. So we saw that yesterday. So it goes like a to the minus 3/2. So now if I substitute this scaling here and figure out what is the theta decaying, then I find that the theta decaying is actually minus 3/2 of delta decaying, okay? So I can represent this decaying mode as the following: a two-component vector for the density and associated velocity perturbation, which basically is the amplitude of the decaying mode times 1, and here times minus 3/2. Okay? Now I go to my problem. So what do I have in my problem? So I have to write down the same vector, and I want to decompose it into a growing mode component and a decaying mode component, okay? So what are the initial conditions? My initial conditions, if I write them this way, it's delta I, okay, for the density, and 0 for the velocity, okay? And so now I want to write this as something here, which basically will be, let's write delta plus, which I need to figure out is going to be the amount which is in the growing mode, plus the delta minus, sorry, which is the amount of decaying mode. That was, I don't know why suddenly out of nowhere. Okay, and so if you do the calculation, now it's very simple, right? So here you need to sum up to delta I here, and you need to sum up to 0. And what do you find? You find delta plus is 3/5 of delta I, delta minus is 2/5 of delta I. And that gives you exactly what you have here, okay? So actually the initial conditions that we picked up, I mean, they are such that only 3/5, okay, is in the growing mode, and actually 2/5 is in the decaying mode, okay? So that's the reason why when then I do the expansion for the growth of the overdensity, what I end up with is what I would expect just from linear growth times this 3/5, okay? Because I'm projecting only the growing mode component, okay, that is tracking the nonlinear growth of the density of this perturbation, okay? So that's the origin of this 3/5. So, let me see. So what do I need to keep here? I guess I can drop most of these things now. So by the way, so you see why I define the velocity divergence theta that way, right? That's just because it's very convenient then to relate delta and theta. Any other choice with extra factor of A dot or A would have made, things more complicated. But this way, you see, it's very simple. You either have delta is theta or delta is minus 3/2 of theta with this definition of the velocity divergence. Okay, so we are nearly, not nearly done, but we are getting closer. So then so I said delta is 3/2 delta I t divided by ti to the 2/3, and that's the linear theory. That's my linear theory prediction. And so now I calculated it from basically the nonlinear delta in the limit t goes to 0 or theta goes to 0, but I can extend it to any time simply using the parametric form of t divided by ti, which I have. Huh? Okay, so I do that, and I get. So now there will be a factor of b. You remember b goes like 1 over delta I to the 3/2. So the 2/3 will give me 1 over delta I. That will cancel the delta I. Okay? And so I get something which is now independent of my choice of delta I and my choice of ti. That's exactly what I wanted. All right? So I get, so there will be a 3/4 here to the 2/2, and then there is this theta minus sin theta to the 2/3. And so I will, this is the linear, of course, growing mode solution for that perturbation. Ooh, huh? A bit, yeah, can I go a bit more? Maybe you want to have a break, you seem to be... Let's have a break, a quick break, a few minutes really, okay? So let's evaluate the linear theory prediction at maximum expansion or turnaround. So we have theta is pi, r is r max as drawn here on the figure. And then we have that the linear theory prediction. Okay, so you just plug theta is pi and you find 3/5 3 pi divided by 4 to the 2/3, and this is approximately 1.062. 1.062. If you calculate the actual nonlinear density at turnaround using the formula 9/2 times, you remember, theta minus sin theta square, and then over 1 minus cos theta cube. Okay, where is this? Maybe I should write it here. Yeah, I think it would be good. If I write it here again, so that would be the nonlinear solution, which is okay. So then if I evaluate this at theta equals pi, I get obviously something larger. I find, so it's precisely 9 pi squared divided by 16, and this is approximately 5.55. Okay, so at turnaround, when basically the perturbation decouples from the Hubble flow and starts collapsing, the linear density is of order unity, the actual density is of order of a few, so we are already entering the nonlinear regime. Okay, basically here, clearly linear theory breaks down. Okay? And now let's go. So the perturbation collapses, and I mean, in our spherical collapse approximation, it collapses to a point of infinite density. Okay, but in practice, that's not what will happen. In practice, because you actually have, I mean, here it's purely radial collapse, but what you have in practice is non-radial collapse with velocity dispersion, etc. And so basically the perturbation virialize, okay, and to reach some equilibrium state, which can be basically described with the virial theorem. And that's how basically, that's this argument which you use in order to calculate the final over density of that perturbation. Okay, so let's do that. So let me go through, it's for, okay, so we use the fact that the perturbation because of non-radial motions will actually, virialize to some equilibrium state, and we use simply the virial theorem, which states that twice the kinetic energy of this bound object plus the potential energy is 0 when it has virialized. So now the total energy is k vir plus potential energy. And so it has to be the same. So this is equal to what? So this is from the virial theorem, this is equal to the half of the potential energy. Okay, it's bound, it's negative. And this is also, this has to be equal from, because of energy conservation, to the energy at turnaround, which is purely potential, again. So this is equal to V max. Okay, so we have 1/2 of potential energy at virialization equal to potential energy at turnaround. Let's just write this here. Okay, so this implies minus Gm R max is 1/2 of minus Gm R vir. So the actual virialization radius, the physical virial radius is actually 1/2 of R max. Okay, so to some extent what the perturbation is doing here is that, so it collapses, and then when it reaches approximately 1/2 of R max here, it virializes, okay, redistributes its kinetic particles exchange energy such as to, here reach some steady state in virial equilibrium, okay, which satisfies the virial theorem, okay? But the assumption is that basically the bound object forms when theta is 2 pi, okay? But obviously that could be discussed, okay? Do I really achieve virialization at theta equals 2 pi or later? It's approximately theta equals 2 pi, okay? Let's say. So if I assume that virialization, occurs at 2 pi, then the time of virialization is the time at, obviously theta equals 2 pi, okay? So I can use this once I make this assumption, okay, when does the object actually virialize and form a virialized bond structure, then I can use this to estimate the final density of this object, okay? So I just need to evaluate basically the actual density at that point. So what is this density? So in unit of the background, okay, so we have to be careful. So it's going to be the density at turnaround, okay, which is equal to 9 pi squared divided by 16. And now there are a couple of factors which we need to take into account. First of all, there is contraction of the radius by a factor of 3. So actually, I need to rescale this by R max divided by R vir cube. That's the volume contraction, and that gives me an extra factor of 8. Okay. And then I need also to take into account the fact that the background density has changed, because I want to relate this overdensity to the actual background density at virialization. Okay. So actually, I have an additional ratio of background densities. Okay? Now, this goes like 1 over t squared. This goes like 1 over t squared, which implies that because you see that T vir, since, I mean, you see this here, all right? T vir is 2t max. And there is a factor of 2 because we have this, where is this expression? Let's check that it's correct. That should be correct. Because t goes like theta minus sin theta. Do you remember? T at turnaround is theta equals pi, so I have pi minus sin pi, which is pi. And then t at virialization, I assume, is that theta equals 2 pi, so I have 2 pi minus sin 2 pi, which is 2 pi. Okay? So t virialization is just twice t max. Okay? So this gives me, because it goes like 1 over, because this goes like 1 over t squared, this gives me an extra factor of 4. Okay? Because the density of the background went down by a factor of 1 over 2 squared, okay, relative to what it was at turnaround, okay? So the actual density, the density of the object at virialization, relative to the background at virialization, is this times this times this, okay? And if you put now numbers, you get, so what do you get? You get 178 approximately, yeah. So you get 178. So the density at virialization is approximately 200 times the density of the background at virialization. So what does this imply? So let's assume that I started with a perturbation, a spherical top hat perturbation, let's say. I picked up a radius of a co-moving radius. So let's write it this way. I started with a co-moving radius x of, let's say, 1.5 megaparsec. So 1.5 megaparsec for our lambda CDM universe, that would correspond to, in terms of co-moving size, that would correspond to basically a halo, of a dark matter halo of approximately a few times 10 to the 13 solar masses. So fairly massive dark matter halo, okay? So this halo basically collapsed out of a patch in the initial condition, which has a co-moving size of 1.5 megaparsec. But now, because mass is conserved and its density increased to approximately 200 times the background until it collapsed today, then today its co-moving size is a factor of, sorry, it's I meant the opposite. I meant the opposite. It's today. Today, sorry, this halo would be a patch of co-moving size 1.5 megaparsec. And so this halo actually collapsed from a patch in the initial condition, which is approximately third root of 178, approximately 6 times larger. Okay? And so in the initial condition, it was basically a patch of order 10 megaparsec. Okay? So initially. The bottom line is the following. You collapse by a factor of third root of this, which is a factor of 6. Okay? So you have the assumption is that mass is conserved. Huh? So you have the same amount of mass here and there, but here you have the background density, and here you are 200 times the background density. Okay? This is regardless, this factor. Yeah, it's really, I mean, from this argument, it's regardless. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, this is absolutely, but obviously that's an approximation, right? But at the end, what you have in your simulations, you don't have top hat perturbations, right? You have this complicated halo, you have these halos with this complicated profile. So you do the following. You need, of course, to agree to what is the virial radius, right? What is the virial radius? And so basically the standard assumption is, well, to define the virial radius as the radius of the dark matter halo within which you have 200 times the density of the background when you identify the halo. Okay, so you use this analytical approximation in order to define what is a halo, what is a halo mass, and what is a halo radius, because usually you have a profile that extends to infinity in principle, right? So the mass of the halo is subject to what you define as a radius. But that's the usual convention, and it's based on this analytical approximation. Now, a few things. So you see, first of all, I told you already that you can extend this to under dense region. One last thing, of course, very important. Actually more important than extending this to under dense region. So that's the actual over density, okay, at virialization, according, the nonlinear over density, okay, assuming virial equilibrium. What is the linearly extrapolated density at virialization? Well, I take the linear approximation and I evaluate it at 2 pi. Okay? So if I would evolve everything according to linear theory, then the density the over density at virialization would be this at 2 pi, and you find the following. So it is and this is 1.68 okay, and this is this is known as the critical, that's basically the critical density for spherical collapse. Okay, so it's a very important number. It's a very important number because it basically linear theory with this threshold gives you the clock which you need to use in order to basically figure out when a small perturbation in the initial condition will collapse into a nonlinear object. And so you will do the following. Let's say now you can go back and to the initial condition and let's say select some arbitrary initial time Ti. At this initial time Ti, you have fluctuations in the density. Okay, if you go back sufficiently early, there will be of order of 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4, around recombination, okay? And then what you do is that you do the simple thing. You assume that they will evolve according to this simplified picture. And so what you have to do in order to find out when they will collapse into into virialized structure without doing any simulation or anything is you pick up the value of that perturbation, okay, which you assume is in the growing mode, okay, so that you just get rid of this factor of 3/5. Huh? You don't have to put it. You just pick up, you assume it's in the growing mode, okay, already. So there is some actually peculiar velocity, as it should be, right? So it's in the growing mode. You rescale it linearly as a function of time according to linear theory, which you have, until you reach 1.68, this critical threshold. And at the time at which you reach this critical threshold, and the time is set by linear theory, you have virialization, and you have formed a virialized halo of dark matter. Okay? So this way, you can really, with this simple picture, you can really understand when structure forms in the universe, and then we will see on which mass scale. Because obviously what will happen is the following, is that there is an extra parameter here, which is really the size of the perturbation. The co-moving size of the perturbation. The bigger the co-moving size, obviously, the more mass I have. So what actually I should be doing, I should take the density, the initial density field, and I should start smoothing it, okay, on different scales, in order to get a sense of what are the fluctuations on a certain scale, right? Obviously, if I want to track a big galaxy cluster, I need to smooth the density field on a fairly large scale. If I want to track a small mass halos, I will smooth it on a smaller scale. Now, what will happen when you smooth? You suppress, you remove power, right? But if your smoothing radius is big, you will remove more power than if your smoothing radius is small. So what does this mean? This means that if you smooth the initial density field at small scales to describe, basically because you're interested in small mass halos, you will have more power left than if you would do it on a bigger scale for a galaxy cluster size halo. So the bottom line is that the fluctuations, if you smooth on small scale initially, they will typically be larger, so you will collapse actually earlier, because you will have larger fluctuations, you grow them with linear theory, you expect that actually you reach this threshold earlier in the universe. If you have big fluctuations for galaxy cluster, you're suppressing the overall amplitude, so you will grow, but you will start from typically lower values, so it will take more time. So these big fluctuations, galaxy clusters, they will collapse later. Okay, so you get this picture of there is some hierarchical growth, right, that basically, okay, follows from linear theory and obviously certain assumption about the behavior of the fluctuation amplitude as I smooth them, okay? But that's basically for typical, lambda CDM cosmologies or cold dark matter dominated cosmologies, that's what happens. When you increase the smoothing, you reduce the fluctuation. If you were in a universe where things work the opposite, that would be completely different, right? Okay, but that's not the case, okay? Here. So what do you expect? You expect that you form, first of all, small mass halos, and then, as time goes by, bigger and bigger structure. And linear theory, with this condition, gives you the clock that you need in order to figure out when they collapse, okay? So you can formalize this. You can formalize this in, that will be very likely my last, the last thing I have to say here. You can formalize this using basically something called as Press-Scherter theory. So I just want to say a couple of words about that. So Press-Scherter, basically in the 70s, they basically did exactly what I just explained to you, okay? So there was this spherical collapse approximation. And then what you do is basically you do statistics of density fluctuations in the initial condition. And you use the spherical collapse as a clock in order to figure out when structures form and on which scales. And you play with the scale. The scale is basically the smoothing of the initial density field, okay? So the bigger the objects you're interested in, the bigger the smoothing you have to apply to the initial density fluctuation. Okay, so let me basically, what you would do is that you would define, if you want, so you would define a linear density field smooth on a certain scale, which I called M, because you can always relate. The smoothing scale will be basically proportional to the third root of the mass, right? And you do this evaluation. You basically, you define the relation between R and M in the unperturbed background. You really go back to an initial time which is essentially 0, where everything is uniform, and there you basically select the patches that you're interested in. And then you use actually, then on top of this you paint density fluctuations, and you use linear theory to evolve these homogeneous patches until they collapse. Okay? So you would write this that way. So in generically, let me put here some redshift, but the redshift, of course, should be very high. So you can express this smoothing procedure in Fourier space. So you would have Fourier mode of the density. Then you have the smoothing kernel, which is spherically symmetric, so it depends only on the modulus of the wave number, and that would be its Fourier transform. And then, okay, this. And then what you do essentially, so of course for this you need some, you need like that's where the physics of the early universe enters, okay? You need to relate really this density to what are the initial conditions at t equals 0, right? So, and basically what you do is that, I wrote it that way. You can express it as some transfer function times basically if you want, the initial fluctuations in the gravitational potential. Or if you prefer, you could also use the co-moving curvature perturbation, but just for simplicity, I wrote it that way. And so one way would be, for instance, here to pick up the gravitational potential deep in matter domination. Just after matter radiation equality, because that's what is most relevant for large-scale structure, for non-relativistic dust. And then here, in this case, in front of this, you have this transfer function which would go like 2/3 of T of K, then the transfer function for matter fluctuations times some growth factor, and then you have to divide by omega and H naught squared, okay? But the bottom line is that, okay, you start with this basically initial linear density field, and you will do statistics. You smooth it, and then you look at the statistical distribution of this fluctuation. And so if you assume Gaussian initial condition, then the 1-point probability distribution of delta M at a certain position x is distributed as a Gaussian. So you basically consider, so P, the probability to have delta M in a small interval is a Gaussian, so it goes like 1 over square root of 2 pi sigma where sigma is a function of the smoothing scale and the cosmology and blah, 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 blah. Okay, obviously, all these parameters. But the main dependence here is the smoothing scale. Okay, and then you ask the following question. So you have this, let's do it like that. So that would be, okay, that's at some initial time, Ti, okay. That's the linear density field, okay? Linear theory is still valid, so you set up the initial condition with linear theory. And then you ask the following. So I smooth this density field on some mass scale, okay, M, which is proportional, which goes like R cubed. And then I ask, what is the filling factor? So what is the fraction of basically the volume for which the density fluctuation delta M exceeds my threshold delta critical? My linear critical threshold for spherical collapse of 1.68. So you define this quantity. And so it's just this integral. And since you have assumed Gaussian initial condition, you can do the calculation very simply. So it is basically 1/2 of the complementary error function. Here I put a nu. It's not neutrinos, it's peak significance. I will tell you what it is. Nu divided by square root of 2, and nu is defined as delta critical divided by sigma. So nu is basically the height of the peaks in unit of a typical 1 sigma fluctuation. So if nu is 3, you are looking at 3 sigma peaks. They are fairly rare. 1 sigma peaks are very common, obviously, and then, okay? And so the idea is that this basically filling factor, so the fraction of the Lagrangian volume, okay, once you have smoothed the field on mass scale m, the fraction of the Lagrangian volume which exceeds this threshold will be related to the fraction, basically the amount of halos of mass m you will collapse, okay, according to this spherical collapse approximation. And so basically the correspondence is obtained as follows. So if I differentiate, okay, so if I differentiate this, I will differ, so this is basically a fraction, right? It's like 1%, 10 to the minus 4, okay, some fraction of the volume. Now, if I differentiate this, I first differentiate this relative to the mass in order to focus on some infinitesimal mass bin, okay? And now I want to convert this, so I need to take an absolute value because generically it's negative. Okay, now I want to convert this into an abundance of dark matter halos. Okay, so what I need to do is that I need to multiply this by basically the mass that I would have in a unit volume. Okay, so the average mass density, and because I do all this in the initial condition where everything is very smooth. Okay, so that would be the fraction of a unit volume that has collapsed into halos of mass m, and then in order to count the number of halos I have in that volume, I just need to divide by m. Okay, I divide the whole amount of mass that I have in this typical, unit size volume, okay, into m, and this will give me the number density of halos of mass m per unit volume, because I took a volume of unity, so it's per unit volume. Okay? Did you get it? So then I do the calculation now because I have this expression there. Okay. And so if you just plug in the error function, okay, so the derivative of the complementary error function will give you back a Gaussian. And then what you do on top of this is that, what they did is that they cheated a bit. Or because of this factor of 1/2. Because you see, there is an issue here. Right? The issue is the following, is that, well, what will collapse are the overdense regions, according to this prescription. The underdense regions, they won't collapse, right? And so they were a bit embarrassed because they wanted to have, basically, some sort of mass conservation. So everything should, at the end, eventually everything should end up in a dark matter halo. But then we are a bit embarrassed because there is a factor of 1/2. So when I take, basically, in the limit where m becomes very small, sigma will go to infinity for a lambda CDM power spectrum. So the argument basically will go to 0, but that gives me 1. So it's 1/2. Okay. So what they did is, okay, well, let's get rid of this factor of 1/2. Let's multiply everything by 2. Okay. Now basically the issue has to do with, the fact that you're not accounting for the possibility that you might smooth on small scales and have another dense region, and a region that is below the threshold, actually, but if you smooth on a bigger scale and include perturbation around it, it might actually be embedded in a bigger region which is above the threshold and could collapse. So you have all this issue of what is known as cloud in cloud, which is not accounted in this picture, okay, in this simple treatment. And the bottom line is that if you do this, and you can do this using something known as excursion set theory, then you can basically explain where this comes from and actually get rid of it, okay? So what they did was, okay, you say it's actually twice, okay? And if you do that, then you get actually a good match already with the numerical data. And so if you do this, that's what you find. Okay, and then there is an extra, so you take the derivative of the complementary error function, and then you have to take, of course, the derivative inside, right? Because it's relative to mass. The mass dependence is in nu. Okay? And then people, they like to write this, slightly differently. So they like to put extra factors of, put an extra factor of nu here and write the ln of nu here, and put an extra factor down of m here, m squared, and write the ln of m. And I will tell you why. So you will see this written that way also. Let's just reorganize this way. So I put an extra factor of nu here, and I put the exponential, the Gaussian here. And then with the extra 1/m here, this gives me the logarithmic derivative of nu and logarithmic derivative of m. The reason for doing this is that for lambda CDM spectrum, called dark matter power spectrum, this is fairly constant across the relevant halo mass range. The mass range relevant for large-scale structure, let's say from halos of 10 to the 10, 11 to 10 to the 16. It varies very little. It varies from basically 0.1 to 0.3, 0.4. So this way, then you clearly see how the mass function will behave. Okay? So you see that, you see the following. In the limit where basically the halo mass is small, so what happens is that, so this is approximately constant, this is approximately unity, the Gaussian. This actually you might be worried because it goes like 1/sigma of m, okay? But it goes to infinity actually very slowly. It goes to infinity much more slowly than 1/m squared is changing. So actually the behavior of the mass function, if you look at halos, let's say, with a mass above 10 to the 10 solar masses, it's 1/m squared in this range, right? So you have m here. Okay, I'm talking about redshift equals 0, obviously, okay, at the moment. So you have n bar of m here, and basically it goes as a power law, m to the minus 2. And then you see that when the peak significance become of order unity or larger, so when you start looking at only very, very large fluctuations relative to the mean, okay, then the Gaussian cutoff kicks in. And so then, at a certain point, at a certain characteristic mass, let's call it m star, then you start having a an exponential suppression. Okay? So that's a redshift 0, and if you had to rescale this at higher redshift, then of course things would go down that way. But it's actually more complicated because there is the issue of merger, okay? Halos can merge with each other, and so that can affect pretty much basically everything, actually. But to some extent, this remains quite actually true. Right? So there's some change here in the slopes, but if you go to higher redshift, you would see basically something like that. And you would see this M star characteristic move to smaller masses. And that again reflects the fact that you have hierarchical collapse. You collapse, and first of all, small mass halos, and then gradually bigger and bigger mass halos. Okay? And so M star actually, you can define M star the following way. So what did I write? So the redshift dependence is encoded in sigma, okay? Because basically what you really have to do is that I wrote down sigma. I talked about the initial density field, okay? Density field in the initial condition. What you have to do is that you have to use the spherical collapse for the clock, okay? So you evolve the initial density field linearly, okay, with linear theory, until the redshift of interest. Okay, and then you look for these regions above threshold, okay? And so the dependence on redshift is actually here, okay? So there is a dependence on mass and on redshift. Okay, so what you can do is that basically you know that you will form halos of a certain mass m when this is basically of order the critical threshold for collapse, okay? And so you can define basically M star, so the characteristic mass for collapse, which will be a function of redshift. You can define what this mass is through the following requirements. So you have you want the following. You want sigma evaluated for M star of Z at redshift Z should be equal to delta critical, which is 1.68 approximately, okay? And that defines what is this critical mass M star. And you will find that in a standard cold dark matter cosmology, it actually grows with decreasing redshift. So it decreases as you go back in time, okay? And so maybe 1-2 more words maybe, because I said I would say something about neutrinos, but I think it's going to be hard. So maybe let's try to very briefly. So if you had to extend this to a cosmology where you have massive neutrinos, let me remove this. You could do it the following way. So you want to do the following. So you want to write so the question is, okay, if I now trade some of the non-relativistic matter for massive neutrinos, okay? So I write omega matter basically will be omega cold dark matter, but let me put cold dark matter and baryon CB, and then omega neutrinos. So if I do that, how is the mass function affected? Let's just look at this briefly. Well, it's relatively simple for the following reason. So we know that basically we have seen yesterday that fluctuations with wave number less than the maximum free streaming scale, so the lowest possible free streaming wave number, okay, which is K free streaming at ANR, we know that these perturbations are not affected, right, by the free streaming of neutrinos. So there everything behaves as cold dark matter. We know actually that on scales much larger than this KNR, I mean, there is a suppression, for instance, in the linear growth rate of, let's say, delta CB, okay, let's put it this way, of cold dark matter baryons. Okay, I'm ignoring the baryon pressure and all this. But, so they would grow like A to the 1 minus 3/5 of F nu for small neutrino fraction. So now let's assume that I want to do Press-Scherter with massive neutrinos. What shall I expect here? So the first thing that I need to worry about is, so is delta critical significantly, is delta critical changed or not by the fact that I would be evolving the perturbation in the cosmologies with massive neutrinos? And the answer is that there is a slight change, but it's very small. And if you do the calculation for realistic neutrino masses, it is a very small change. So you can still use the value of 1.68. Okay? Now you have to agree on, okay, what do I mean by now halo? Because I told you dark matter halo, but now I have cold dark matter and massive neutrinos. I want to compare, I want to make predictions which I can compare to simulations. I need to agree on what I define as a dark matter halo. And the usual way to go is to identify dark matter halos in the cold dark matter component. So you don't include the massive neutrinos. And the reason is that they can just easily free stream out of the potential well. So there is no reason for including them. Okay? So what people do usually is that they go to their simulation in which they have cold dark matter particles and massive neutrinos, but they identify the virialized halos only in the dark matter component, okay? So that's a choice, okay? So if you do that, okay, and then you go back to the mass function, so then what you have to do here, you have raw matter, okay? You have to take here only the cold dark matter and plus baryon, because they are basically the same for me at the moment. This here should be replaced by rho CB, okay? Excluding neutrinos. And now there is another place obviously where all this matter, it's the sigma, okay? The sigma that enters here. So for sigma, okay, you need to do the same. So we said rho m, you use rho CB, and for sigma, same story. You will actually use sigma CB. Okay? Because you will do statistics of cold dark matter plus baryon fluctuation only. Okay? Not massive neutrinos. But when you evaluate this variance, you must include the back reaction of massive neutrinos on the growth rate of these fluctuations. So the growth factor that you will put here in the transfer function will include the effect arising from the free streaming of massive neutrinos. Okay, so at small scales, basically the fluctuation will be suppressed. The fluctuations in cold dark matter and baryon, they will be suppressed by the free streaming of massive neutrinos. And now actually for basically objects up to cluster size halos, so 10 to the 16, the co-moving scale of this object in the initial condition is always basically smaller than the KNR. Okay, so they are always affected by free streaming. Okay. The bottom line is the following, is that what happens is you would expect naively, okay, small mass objects are more affected. To some extent it's true, but the thing, look at the sensitivity of the mass function. You have this exponential sensitivity here on sigma. So in fact, what happens is that when you start converting cold dark matter into massive neutrinos, okay, the sigma for the more massive halos will be less affected. But because it appears here in the exponential, at the end, the effect on the mass function is much stronger. So what you get is a fairly strong suppression of the abundance of massive halos when you start exchanging cold dark matter for massive neutrinos. And the effect is smaller at low mass. So when I start increasing mu, I see a strong suppression for rare massive halos. That's what's going on. Okay? So basically the abundance of galaxy clusters, obviously this is all, I'm all talking at fixed omega matter, okay? So I'm just trading cold dark matter for massive neutrinos, okay? That's what I'm doing here. So a fixed omega matter, that's what you expect. A suppression of the abundance of massive halos, basically, okay? So, well, I didn't have time to talk about other things. I think I have to stop anyway. So, thank you very much.